Okay, hi, a very good afternoon and a warm welcome to everyone in Manila in person in our meeting room in Manila. But we are also have a good number of participants who are joining us online via Zoom. So a very warm welcome to this very important panel discussion. As the title of the panel suggests, it's opening up climate finance to public scrutiny. So before we begin proper, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Clara Feng. I am the Regional Advisor for Asia for CoST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative. And we would like to thank the organizers, particularly the Philippine management team of the OGP Asia and the Pacific Regional Meeting for giving us this space to discuss this topic. And with us today, we have a very esteemed panel of 3 female speakers. So I think we're all very pleased to say that we have got an all-star female panelist. And before I commence, I'll do a very brief introduction of each speaker, and we'll of course have a very interactive session today. So we will also have an opportunity to have questions from the floor in this room, and as well as for our online participants over Zoom. Please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A or either the chat box function, and our colleagues will compile the questions and we will pose it to the panelists. So I think this was a good opportunity for me to turn to the panelists. And so on our extreme left, we have Dr. Allinnettes Adigue, who is the GRI ASEAN Hub Head, and she is tasked to promote the practice of transparency reporting across Southeast Asia by working with relevant stakeholders. She's got an amazing career spanning across 3 continents. She has worked in academia, in government, in the Office of the President in Philippines, and as well as in the private sector in retail energy, electricity provision. And she, of course, did her PhD in specifically on climate change policy and economics. And so we're very pleased to have Ellie with us in the room today, and she will share her expertise on what GRI does, especially in the Southeast Asian context. And next up, we have Ms. Esmyra Javier. She is the Senior Climate Change Specialist at the Asian Development Bank, and she's been there for, she's a veteran of over 10 years at the ADB. So she is the focal of the Multilateral Development Bank's working groups on climate finance, and she has an extensive experience in research, administrative, and program management in the fields of climate change, environment, and resource economics and development. And so prior to ADB, she had worked in UNDP, WWF, and also taught in academia and universities in the Philippines and Canada. And last but not least, we have Dr. Evelyn Hernandez. She is the head of members and affiliates at CoST, and she leads the technical assistance, capacity building services, and supporting the design and implementation of CoST programs globally. So Evelyn had also previously served as the CoST technical advisor, leading the development of the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard, which was done in collaboration with the Open Contracting Partnership, and she had also helped develop the Infrastructure Transparency Index. So Evelyn had started her career as the country manager for CoST Honduras in 2014. So she's a CoST veteran, and she led the implementation of the award country program for over 4 years prior to joining the secretariat. Evelyn has an academic background in political sciences, public administration, and law. All right, okay, so I hope I didn't miss out anything, but we'll have a chance for the audience to quiz our panelists a bit more about their work and their background. But maybe before we begin the panel proper, I think we'll just pose a question to each and one of your, for you to just talk about why transparency is important in climate finance, and what are some of the key challenges facing it. And specifically, what does your organization do to contribute to improving transparency and accountability in climate finance? So I think maybe we'll just start with the left, with Ellie first, and then we'll go downwards towards Evelyn. And I'll just like to ask our speakers to keep their comments to about 10 minutes, and then we'll have opportunities to have more questions later. All right, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. Before I answer your wonderful question, Let me just greet everyone a very good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. I just wanted to share that I've known Clara for a long time, maybe 100 years, right? This is the first time we're working together, so it's really nice. But I have to answer the question. Okay. Why is transparency important in climate finance? So maybe like do a simple definition for us. So when we talk about climate finance, these are financing that goes to climate resilience, adaptation, and mitigation projects, whether at the country level, community level, and normally, I'm not coming from a organization that gives out climate finance, but normally, from my understanding, it involves public funds, right? So either it's contributed by countries or through given by philanthropic organizations. So when we talk about money, their public funds, there should be transparency, and we know that, like even in every government, there should be transparency on how money is being used. So that's why we need transparency. Now the question is, how do you measure transparency on how climate financing is used? I come from the Global Reporting Initiative, so we've been around since 1997, so we're coming to our 30 years. We are the pioneer of sustainability reporting, and transparency is our middle name. So we promote sustainability reporting for companies to be transparent and accountable for their sustainability impacts, meaning in the course of their operations, how do they impact the economy, the environment, and society? So for the most part, it's the private sector or corporations that are using GRI standards for their sustainability reports. Because for many years now, it's the regulators or the exchanges that are requiring companies to write sustainability reports. Of course, just to clarify, GRI standards is not just exclusively for corporations. It just so happens that corporations in the course of their business operations have a huge impact to the economy, environment, society. But any organization or entity that has an impact, an external impact, can use the GRI standards. So for climate financing, this could also be an effective tool to keep track of how the funding is being used. Because normally, when there's finance, if there's a project, right, it's kept track based on the progress of the implementation. But with sustainability reporting, it's not just, if on third month, you've already dug the ground, or the 6th month, you've already built the sewage plant, all that stuff. But it's not, tracking is not just about the progress of the project itself, but also measuring and communicating to the public, to the stakeholders, what is the impact of that project using climate finance to the economy, environment, and society. Is that 10 minutes already?
Yes. No, actually, there's still more time, but don't worry. I think let's go on to Esmyra.
Okay, thank you. I don't think that was 10 minutes though.
I can speak more if you want.
All right. So, first of all, thank you to the organizers for the invitation. It's good that Asian Development Bank is based in the Philippines, so it's easy for us to participate in this important forum. So, just before I answer your question, just to give you a quick overview of ADB, or Asian Development Bank, in the context of climate finance. So, it was just late last year where we've actually upped our climate finance target to reach at least 100 billion by 2030 in terms of climate finance, and that 50% of our total portfolio actually contributes to climate change project. It used to be just an ambition of 100 billion. Now it's really a target to actually surpass that 100 billion. Now, in terms of the questions of transparency, of course, transparency, especially in climate finance, is a critical element because it helps actually drive global and local climate finance projects or climate change projects in our client countries. It actually helps build confidence among donors, parties, and stakeholders. And it makes us ensure that our climate finance are reactive to the needs and context of our countries, at least in the context of international financing institutions such as ADB. Now, in terms of challenges, there's a lot, right? And it comes rooted from what is climate finance. Generally, it is investments or financing that goes to mitigation and adaptation projects in general. But then not everyone considers it the same in terms of definition. So there is a challenge of definition. There's a challenge of methodology. How do we measure it? Can we count There's a lot of methodology out there from the OECD, who uses Rio markers. There is also a joint multilateral development bank framework, which all the MDBs are using. And of course, there's also the UNFCCC, Standing Committee on Finance. So there's quite a bit of approach that can be used to measure climate finance. So that's a challenge. And of course, in that context, there would be data inconsistencies as well as accuracy. And how do you compare this data? Is it apple oranges or apple and lemons? So those are the kind of challenges that are being faced. And of course, with that, comes to a conclusion that some of this climate finance could be greenwashing or SDG washing in general. So it's quite a challenge. Now, from the Asian Development Bank side, I think ADB is a pioneer in terms of being transparent in terms of its climate finance as well as its climate change project. In fact, we're the first bank to actually publish all climate change related projects on our website. So it's easily downloadable. We put ourselves out there for scrutiny with CSO, civil society organizations, as well as other think tanks, because our data is out there. And it is not just at the project level, but even at the component level. Our climate change action plan, which was approved a couple of years ago, that runs into 2030, actually highlights the importance of transparency and accountability. And that's why under that plan, we are setting up monitoring progress in terms of how we deliver climate finance. And we can talk about a little bit more about how we're shifting from climate finance, which is just actually an input, to, as Ali has mentioned, focusing on impacts and outcomes, which I think it's more critical at the end of the day that we measure progress on. Another thing that ADB is doing is actually working with the other multilateral development banks. So this is basically the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, EBRD, the European Bank for Rural Reconstruction, European Investment Bank, New Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So there's like 10 of us in this group where we actually develop a framework for each of us to measure and report on climate finance. So at least across the MDBs, we actually have comparable climate finance data. So if World Bank says this is an adaptation project with this much adaptation finance, it would have been a similar approach if ADB was investing in the same project. That is one of our major contributions in terms of overcoming the challenges, is coming up with this kinds of methodology and approach. And we're very transparent because we have actually published this in all of the MDB's website on the methodology and the common principles of measuring mitigation and adaptation finance. Now, in addition, MDBs have also committed to be Paris aligned. What does Paris alignment means? It is that all our climate finance or all our finance contributes to low carbon and climate resilient development. This is embedded in Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which was adopted in 2015 in the Paris COP21. That is a contribution in terms of addressing some of the challenges. But I think one critical point that I actually forgot, and if I may add, is that under the Paris Agreement, transparency is a critical element through the enhanced transparency framework, where all countries are obligated to submit, biannual transparency reports, progress that they made on their nationally determined contribution, which actually contains each of the countries' commitments towards meeting greenhouse gas emission reduction target by 2030 or by 2035, as well as the national adaptation plans. And to add, in terms of transparency and climate finance, if you've heard about the NCQG or the new collective quantified goal, which was announced at the COP29 in Baku last November, around 300 billion is expected to flow from developed countries to developing countries by 2035. Now, that commitment was made through a 3-year process where all parties, all countries, including international or observer organizations, as well as CSOs, were all a part of the dialogue. It's at the global scale, at the regional scale, and at the local level, transparency in terms of what we're using or how much we're using in terms of finance and delivering on climate change solution is a critical component.
All very important work. All right, okay, great. So let's hear from Evelyn, I think specifically on what CoST does.
Thanks, Clara. It's a very good question to start. So good afternoon, everyone. Very proud and honored to share this panel with you, ladies. What I want to say is, from a CoST perspective, CoST is the initiative for transparency in infrastructure. And based on the sector in which we work, I want to talk about 3 points. The first one is that we know that the infrastructure networks are being affected by climate change. These networks are suffering the physical impacts, and that is a fact. This will continue over the years. The second point that I would like to raise is that we will need new assets, of course. We continue our development, but also we will need to think about retrofitting or decommissioning, replacing, and protect the existing infrastructure. So we know that we need a lot of investments in mitigation, mainly in the sectors related to buildings, to energy, and to transport. But also we need a lot of resources, much more resources to projects aiming to adaptation, basically, and more importantly, into the water sector. It is critical, and also in protective infrastructure. So the second point, I will end by saying that we know already that we need around $7 trillion every year by 2030 to invest in sustainable infrastructure. And the third point that I would like to make is that we know we require this amount of investments. And unfortunately, we also know that around 10 to 30%, in some countries, up to 50% of these investments are at risk because of inefficiencies, mismanagement, and corruption. That's why transparency is crucial, but I will say more than that, it's an imperative. We cannot allow to lose more resources aiming to adaptation and mitigation to climate change. Now, what is that we are doing to help, to contribute? It's a modest contribution. It's something that we can do based on our practice. In 2019, we developed with our colleagues at Open Contracting Partnership Open Data Standard for infrastructure. And the idea of this standard is to help our governments to publish data around their infrastructure investments. But just recently, with GIZ, with their support, their financial and technical support, we could develop an extension that is what we call a module about climate finance. And the idea is to provide governments with tools and resources to publish data domestically. And the idea is that the governments are accountable to their nationals by publishing data and explaining how the climate finance finance resources are being channeled and implemented in their jurisdictions, but also explaining how the projects are aligned to the Paris Agreement and how they are aligned to the national priorities too. It depends on the context, of course. And more importantly, I think the idea of explaining to the citizens how the projects that they are developing are achieving the climate goals, but beyond of that, economic, social, and environmental impacts. So in a nutshell, this is what we are doing as CoST about transparency in climate investments. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much to our panelists for this first round. And I think it was really interesting that how you all talked about like specifically transparency, but not transparency for just sake, right? It's a process to ensure that the funds are actually being effectively utilized. And so I think we also touched a bit about, I know Esmyra and both Ellie and Evelyn had mentioned about this concept of data standards interoperability, right? Because I think it's been an alphabet soup, right? Hearing about all the different standards that organizations are using and how we're also trying to improve interoperability between that. So I'm just thinking for this next round of questions, if I could ask you all to maybe explain a bit more about how specifically your organizations are working in terms of ensuring that these disclosure standards are easily understood by the users of this end data point, right? Whether it's the civil society organizations or for governments in terms of decision making. So perhaps you could explain a bit more. So maybe I could ask Evelyn to start first, because I think you just ended, so I think it would be a good segue to specifically what you mentioned. So I think you mentioned about this new data standard that was developed as a add-on to the protocol to the Open Contracting Infrastructure Data Standard. And so could you explain a bit more on this and how, because I know you mentioned about the whole operations and maintenance and also decommissioning of projects, because I think for us in the room, usually when you think of infrastructure construction projects, it's always just the building stage, right? But we don't talk so much about the operations and maintenance. So could you explain a bit more about this standard and how you ensure its interoperability with other data standards?
Yes, thanks, Clara. I need to explain that in order to develop this new module or extension, what we did is to work in South Africa with the different stakeholders, the government, the donor community, civil society, private sector, academia, and media. And what we discussed with them is, please help us to understand your needs. What is that you would like to know about climate finance in your country? And after several discussions, we arrived to the conclusion, it's just 7 questions that we summarized, but the main interest is to know the accessibility of climate finance, how accessible these resources are, if the amounts that we have available are enough for the needs that we have, if the quality of the climate finance is appropriate, but also if the decision-making process is conducting to legitimate decisions. Who is taking or making these decisions on behalf of who? And also important to know if the objective of the investments are clearly defined and if we have the impacts, the positive impacts in the climate, as you mentioned, dear panelists, and also if we are bringing co-benefits to the people receiving, the either around mitigation or adaptation project. So when we arrived to the conclusion that these were the important questions, the relevant questions for South Africa, what we did is to develop a series of indicators, and from that we define the data points that could respond to help us to measure those indicators and with those indicators to respond to the questions. So we did the process understanding the needs of people, different people, and then working on that. So after that, it's a very technical piece of work, I have to say, so I will try not to enter into details, but the idea is that we develop a series of guidance notes, tools, resources for different type of audience, non-technical audience. I'm a lawyer, so it's not about the data, the format, the structure, the fields. It's about understanding why we are doing this. And also we have the technical part, and we have all the support. And these resources, all of them are freely available in our website. And also, if you need, you can contact us and we can provide assistance. So how we ensure that this is the interoperability with other standards? Well, when we did this technical part, we had to document every one of the data points. And what we do is to reference to existing work. We are not creating this from zero, believing that we are going to provide the solution. No, we look at what we have in the public domain, and we use as much as possible existing work. And for instance, we have a lot of reference to ISO standards, to open contracting with the public-private partnership extension that they have, and also beneficial ownership data standard. This is just to mention a few, but we try to reference as much as possible existing work. And in that sense, we try to guarantee that this can be a value added, something that will complement and not trying to substitute any of the existing work. And with modesty, we offer this to the governments to be accountable to the citizens.
Thank you. All right, so maybe now I could turn back to Ellie as well. So I think, since we're still on the topic of disclosure standards, so GRI has been the pioneer on this field. And I'm just wondering, specifically, obviously it started more from an organization disclosure level, but now you've also moved more to specific industries as well. So I'm just wondering how, this role of where corporates and government reporting standards and the requirements play in ensuring that this climate financing investments are actually leading to measurable climate action, and also whether you could give us some insights on specifically Asian organizations, because I think somehow there's this belief that it's very much led by the West, and like Asian organizations are playing a bit of a catch-up game, but that's actually not true, because we do see quite a lot of innovative examples coming from Asia as well. So perhaps you could also give us some examples in the context of your work and how these organizations have also been spearheading these efforts.
Before I answer the question, I always do that. I just want to ask in this room, because I always do this, I just want to have a show of hands. Who among you have heard of the Global Reporting Initiative? Not including my colleagues. Okay. Okay, very few. It means I'm not doing such a good job in ASEAN, considering that we've been around for almost 30 years. So yes, you're right. We are the pioneer of sustainability reporting. In fact, just to give you a bit of history, so we were created in 1997, and at the time, companies are just required to write financial reports. And for those who are already alive during the 90s, we would know. Don't deny it, I can see. We would remember, pre-social media. In the news, there's a lot of news about, corporate misbehavior in terms of human rights, environmental law violations. And I think the trigger point for the creation of GRI is the Exxon Valdez oil spill at Alaska, off the coast of Alaska Sea. We all remember that. Yeah. So that's why our creator said that, a financial report doesn't really show how a company is performing in terms of its impact externally. It could have very, beautiful numbers, but in terms of impact to the external environment, economy, and society, it could be doing really bad. And we've seen that, like, another recent corporate scandal was Volkswagen. And what's interesting about it is when I'm already doing the negative examples. So when the emissions gate scandal came out, surprisingly, 2 months before, they have been upgraded in the sustainability index, right? So even if they are reporting, a report in itself is not a guarantee that if you have a sustainability report, a company is actually performing, behaving in a sustainable manner. So going back to your point about, the misconception that the East, particularly ASEAN and Asia, is behind in terms of sustainability. Maybe there is some truth on that, but you have to look at the history, right? Let's do a bit of history first. A history lesson. We know that a lot of Asian countries were colonized, and our corporations, right? We come from a colonial history. And of course, a lot of our corporations are quite young if you compare it, to hundreds, century-old companies in the West. So, because they started very late in the game, of course, the focus is on survival, right? We remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Before you go to the transcend. But I think there's a study that it's already obsolete. But anyway, let me just use that example. Before you can go to that transcendental stage, you have to hurdle the basic needs first. And I think that's where our Asian and ASEAN corporates came from. In terms of requirement for sustainability reporting, that is true. We're a bit behind. In ASEAN, the first country that have required sustainability reporting was Thailand, which was around 2012. And then the rest, the other 5 countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, and Singapore, it was around 2016 onwards that companies were required to do sustainability reporting. But I can say that even if in terms of regulation, we are a bit late, in terms of action, we are moving quite fast. And the good thing about where we are, ESG is not a political issue. It's not politicized. We recognize the impact of climate change. We recognize the importance of ESG. Climate change for us is not addressing the impact, the negative impact of climate change means lives and livelihoods that are at stake. So that's why our governments are moving, fast. And I can see that because I work with the ASEAN bodies, and they really take it seriously. And going back to reporting, so reporting is a report card. Like we all went to school, we need a report card at the end of the year. I cannot just apply for a job with you and say, I'm brilliant, I'm valedictorian, magna cum laude. So you have to have a report card. So sustainability report is like a report card of companies. And if you have a sustainability report, because there's more and more recognition about the importance of sustainability, there's more financing available for organizations to use that financing to transition into more environmentally friendly operations, or sorry, I lost my thought. Yeah, so there's more financing available, right? But again, so when you want to avail of that financing, you have to have proof. But the thing is, because sustainability reporting is still quite new in this part of the world, there's still some knowledge gap at the level of those who want to avail of financing, and at the same time, those who are giving out financing. I will not name names, but I've spoken to some banks where they offer sustainability-linked loans and products, and they, of course, when you provide that financing, as I said, you have to have proof. So more often than not, they would ask for sustainability reports, right? And there is a knowledge gap from like, for example, if an SME is trying to avail of it, so all of a sudden they're asked to write a report. So they don't know how to properly write a report. And then from the financial institution is also the first time that they're doing such a thing, because more and more monetary banks are requiring banks to offer sustainable finance. So we are now in the situation of the blind leading the blind, right? So you're asking someone to report when you don't know how to review the report. Because there's this misconception that when you talk about sustainability, it's just about the environment, but the E and the S and the G are all interconnected. So when I speak to these financing institutions, normally they just look for the E. For example, you're an SME doing retrofit works. I use the example of Singapore. Okay, now I gave a hint. That bank is in Singapore. Okay, so for example, the SME is an SME that does retrofitting in terms of air conditioning and equipment in buildings. So of course there is the E part. And when I spoke, and they said they just look at the E part, and I said, but what about the S part? And they asked, so what is the S impact of that? And I said, well, the workers of that SME are not from Singapore. I've never seen a Singaporean construction worker, right? So most of those workers are from overseas. And with the pandemic, there's strict regulation about people coming in. So that there will be an S impact on the business, right? So I always tell them it's all about materiality. And going back to the GRI standards, and going back, sorry, I digress. I will make that connection, don't worry. Talking about climate financing, right? So GRI standards have energy and climate change standards. So when you talk about climate change, standards or keeping track, like the GHG protocol, it just talks about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, which is of course important because we're talking about emissions and climate change, and emissions are driving climate change. But the E also has an S impact. That's why we care about pushing for climate finance, because if we don't mitigate the impact of climate change, we're all dead, right? We care because it affects us. If it doesn't affect us, human beings, we don't care, basically. So for the GRI standards, our new energy and climate standards, we just don't talk about your climate mitigation and emissions reduction plans. We also talk about the impact on human beings, on the workers, on vulnerable communities. A case in point, I keep talking about negative examples. Don't worry, I'll talk about positive examples. A case in point, we're already experiencing the impact of climate change in our everyday lives. But how does that relate to workers? If you remember, a couple of years ago was World Cup, right? And it was hosted by Qatar. So I don't know if you watched all those documentaries. I was like binging on all those documentaries. So leading up to the World Cup, of course, whenever there's this big events, there's like a rush to build infrastructure, big stadiums that after the event will just be white elephants. Anyway, that's not the point. And we know Qatar is, it's in the Middle East, very warm. So they hired a lot of overseas construction workers. And then they were just like falling like flies one by one. Imagine a 27-year-old dying of cardiac arrest. That's not normal. And if it's happening by the hundreds, there must be something wrong. And so it was an international furor. And of course, there's some investigation, and companies should be held liable. Some of them, were penalized, but just slap in the hand, right? But none of them were really held accountable for those hundreds of construction workers who died. I'm making that relation between the E and the S. Now, I don't want to make everyone depressed and think that Ali is saying that we have no hope, then we just wait for the planet to melt and die, right? Of course not. I mean, of course, a lot of you have children, right? So, of course, we owe it to our kids to leave them a much better, planet than when we left it. So going back again, I'm going round and round. Going back again to your question, of course, as I said, ASEAN companies are also moving as fast as possible. So in terms of sustainability reporting, just to give an illustration, as I said, we were a bit late in the game in terms of reporting, but looking at the rate of reporting, because right now reporting is only required for large listed companies. So I can say now that in the 6 countries that I mentioned, at least 85% are reporting using GRI standards. And almost 100%, of course, are reporting because if the regulator tells you to report, of course you do that. Because if everyone did the right thing, we don't need governments, right? So the requiring companies to do sustainability report is an effective way to drive sustainability. Now, on your point, I'm trying to make up because I had 5 minutes left earlier. But anyway, on the point of the government, so corporations are the ones initially required to report because by their sheer size, right, they have a huge impact to the economy, environment, and society. But if you think about it, governments actually have a much larger impact because in any given country, the government would be the largest employer, the largest procurer of goods and services, the largest provider of goods and services. But only very few countries are requiring government agencies and entities to do sustainability reports. In Korea and Japan, stat boards are required to report. In terms of ASEAN, Singapore is already requiring ministries and stat boards, meaning government-owned controlled corporations, to do sustainability report. But globally, probably around 10% or even less than 10% of governments are doing sustainability report. So my point is, in all of what I said, so sustainability reporting, as I said, is a good gauge of how companies, organizations, government are performing in terms of their impact. But the challenge is, how do you make sure that they're reporting, accurately and correctly? Because you mentioned about greenwashing, and when we talk about greenwashing, there's also intentional greenwashing, and there's the sin of omission. You didn't know that you committed greenwashing. So the sustainability ecosystem still leaves much to be developed. Of course, assurance is a good way of verifying, but again, in terms for regulators, they're also treading carefully because assurance also costs money, right? And when you talk about assurance, also, is there enough supply? Are there enough professionals that can do assurance? Okay, I think now I've exceeded my time. I'll stop there.
No, I love this. I mean, we just had a very interesting exposition from a historical viewpoint to a sociological viewpoint to a psychological viewpoint and to obviously a scientific perspective. But no, I love it. And I think this is really setting a very good context for our discussions because I think at the end of the day, it seems to be quite esoteric, right? Transparency for the sake of it. But it really does have a very relevant and personal impact on all our lives, right? We touched a lot of points, and I would love to dissect a bit more, but I think maybe I'll just turn to Esmyra first before we go into a bit more detail to what you've just talked about. So I think for Esmyra, you did mention at the beginning about ADB aiming to be the climate bank for Asia and the Pacific through the commitment of funds of over 100 billion in climate finance by 2030. And you also talked about a lot of the transparency safeguards that ADB has already undertaken. But I was wondering whether you could delve a bit more, maybe give us a few specific examples from Asia and the Pacific in terms of how countries are actually interpreting and implementing it, because I think that's where the devil's in the details, right? Because again, very big, lofty, ambitious goals, but how does it translate to action on the ground? So maybe you could give us a bit of examples on that.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank Ali for aging us all, because if you remember the Exxon Valdez, which I do, okay, it means I was born because it was such a huge environmental impact, which actually drove me to work in NGOs like WWF, among other things. So a couple of things before I directly give examples, right? There's two things, right? When ADB has its own climate finance, but we also access other financing, such as the Green Climate Fund, if you heard about it, the GCF, the Climate Investment Fund as well. So we're implementing entities. And in those contexts, when we access those funds, there's actually an existing monitoring framework for each of these funds that we have to report on progress that we've made in terms of the climate finance that we've accessed. And this is published on their websites themselves. So that in alone is quite transparent for the donors as well as the users of the funds. Now, at least in ADB, what we have is what we call the corporate results framework, where we actually report on our own progress. First, at ex ante, which means certain indicators are reported at the commitment or at the board approval, and as well as the completed projects. And you mentioned that. No, sometimes we look at as an input, but we forget how it actually happens in terms of the implementation and once the project is actually completed. So ADB does that, and we report that under our development effectiveness review report. It's an annual report that we do. And Ali would be very proud of this. Since 2007, ADB has been actually publishing our sustainability report biannually. And actually, this allows our stakeholders to assess ADB's operational and organizational sustainability performance, providing them with a single point of reference. Ali, again, would be very happy that we have been using since 2007 the Global Reporting Initiative Content Index, which actually sets ADB's management approaches to the topics and our responses to the general and specific disclosure in the GRI sustainability reporting standards, which actually there's like hundreds of it that we're reporting in terms of the index. Now, this is quite a value addition for us because we report on certain indicators that are not in our annual report or the development effectiveness report. This is actually used by many of our stakeholders, including our own investors in green bonds. So the sustainability report is quite critical for us. But in terms of disclosure, ADB in 2022 actually signed up for the task force on climate-related financial disclosure, and we've actually published our report, and an update is to be published soon, early this year. So this is actually considering climate change risk and climate finance in the wider context of our operational risk management. So in those contexts, sustainability report, the TCFD report, I think ADB is quite ahead in terms of making sure that we are transparent in not just in climate finance, but in all the operations. Now, in terms of country-specific context, for the past 3 years, ADB had this technical assistance, which we called NDC Advance. It actually supports our client countries in implementing their nationally determined contributions. And one component of that is actually developing monitoring and reporting mechanisms on the progress that they made on these NDCs. Now, you would find that we actually work in 22 countries, and you would find that many of them doesn't have a system that has been set up to actually report on any progress. So what they have is an implementation plan, what they have is a commitment, but it's critical that they actually report on progress to ensure that they're actually reaching the commitment if there is a future for the planet. And two is that for donors or other stakeholders, if there is a need for further climate finance, that's the only way that we know. So, for example, in Mongolia, we've actually developed a climate finance monitoring system for them to actually use and report on climate finance. So Mongolia, for example, has a green taxonomy. So they know the definition of what could be green and not green. And the central bank, as well as a lot of private financing institution, actually uses this. So based on that, we've actually built a database for them to actually provide inputs on the climate change project and at least the definition of that country. But even before that, there was no system available. So I think it's critical, and going back to like the data needed, even with data, you have to have a reporting system to actually report on that transparency. So that's one example. Now, we also work with other countries such as PNG. They actually have interestingly, quite an advanced system in terms of reporting on GHG emissions as well as on climate finance. So each country has a different starting off point in terms of reporting climate finance. So we've seen that. So each country has varying degree of needs. Some has needs for platform, while some actually needs just capacity building on defining, again, climate finance, how to measure it, and how to report it. For example, in Sri Lanka, we actually provided a capacity building workshop on how to report on greenhouse gas emissions as part of their NDC commitments under the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement. So a lot of component in the context of capacity building. They're all different from different countries. Reporting platforms. Normally, they want online platforms as well. At the same time, it's the definition and the methodology and the data is actually quite critical in terms of reporting that. And just to add, in terms of progress, normally when it comes to mitigation, we only report on GHG emissions reductions because that's what's tangible. And of course, there's the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and we can go into the technicalities of those three things. But it's difficult for some countries, especially scope 3. So the methodology, although it's there and established, it's also need the capacity building for many of these countries to actually report on scope 3 emissions. But at the same time, it's not only that, right? When you're talking about infrastructure, we're also reporting on climate change solutions that has been developed. So, the megawatts, how many renewable energy in Cambodia has been generated by this project. So that's another option to report on progress as well, which is actually translate as an outcome or an output from the climate finance that has been put in. So.
Okay, wow. Okay, I think this is a really interesting segue because you're talking about how countries have been putting up mechanisms to collect and actually interpret the data. But I'm also wondering in terms of the actual data utilization. Ellie also talked about the assurance, professionals having some kind of independent process to actually verify this data, right? So I'm just wondering on this note, perhaps Evelyn, you could share a bit more about CoST, how CoST has been working with civil society, academia to kind of work on the interpretation and the utilization of this data.
The idea of publishing data is that we find someone that will use it, will analyze and will understand, and based on a series of indicators that we provide, civil society can measure those and ask the governments the right questions and advocate for reforms, as we do within the OGP community. We work with governments, we co-create solutions. And basically, when you do this type of advocacy based on evidence, using the data that is public, that has been, is official data, it's difficult for a government to say, no, this is not true, because it's the data that they provide. So the idea of developing capacities in civil society, in media, in youth organizations is that we develop this basis for a dialogue within the countries in which citizens support the government and governments respond to the citizens. So the idea for us is to develop capacity building programs, which we are doing with our members globally, but also we are providing a series of tools to make more easy to understand, developing some analytical dashboards based on demand. Basically, we ask, what is that you would like to know? And we are going to analyze automatically when we have access to data that is complete, data that is quality of data that is complete, is complying with the standards, so we can use and develop these analytical dashboards to facilitate the understanding of it. We have also an assurance process as an independent review of data that is more technical, but of course is another way of providing feedback to the governments to improve, in this case, the investments. And since we are discussing about sustainability, it's good to mention that we have this extension of climate finance, but we also have 4 more that are available, and they are referring to environmental aspects of infrastructure projects, social aspects, as you mentioned, the safety measures for workers, the type of jobs that are generated in infrastructure projects, And also we have the governance part, we call the institutional one. And we also have the economic part, because we associate sustainability not just to environmental, social, and governance, but also the economic sustainability of projects. So those extra modules are available too. And I think in this part we can contribute for governments to publish more data and then use the reporting mechanisms that you are suggesting. So synergies at all.
Oh, yes, of course, Esmyra, please.
This will only take 2 minutes. Oh, no, it was just interesting about when you started, when you say, they use it, right? Because a lot of the capacity building that we've done, a lot of the platforms we'd actually develop, as well as the mechanism, is a question of whether they will use it. For my experience is that some countries do use it, but it's a question of how the sustainability on how far they're going to use it. So we've seen people who have left their jobs and changing, not just the ministers, but changing management within the ministries have actually, shifted some of those priorities. And with that shift is that some of the things that have been already started on, like reporting platforms and other mechanisms, some of them have not continued it. So it's challenging to work in the region in general, I guess, would be that.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I think working across Asia, we've seen these often projects that were started with very good intentions, but somehow, again, due to many reasons, they've been, I guess, discontinued. And it's a pity. But I'm also wondering, moving forward, at least there is some kind of foundational level that has already been developed. But also, I guess for us, it's also about kind of leveraging and building on this that has already been built. I guess that capacity has already been developed within each organization. So, I think there's a lot more that we can discuss, but I think this is also a good opportunity for us to kind of open up the floor to questions, from the audience, both in person as well as online, whether there's any specific questions, because I know through this session we've discussed a lot of wide-ranging topics, but I thought it would be good for us to perhaps hear from you as well, what you would like to discuss, or perhaps raise a point or comment on what has been discussed so far.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Katrina from the Global Reporter Initiative. I'm Alice's colleague based here in the Philippines. And this question is primarily to Esmyra. So we're talking about climate finance, and you highlighted perfectly, how we're going through right now in terms of our mitigation and adaptation initiatives. But what I'm curious about as well, coming into this subject matter, is also a climate-related loss and damage fund. And I'm just really curious, for instance, how investment banks such as the ADB partake in bringing in this kind of fund into the current pool of climate finance. Maybe also for the benefit of our audience, we all know what mitigation and adaptation is, but when it comes to LND, or the loss and damage, this is a term that was coined, I think, maybe 30, 40 years ago, and has been highlighted in COP27 back in 2022. And basically, LND just talks about the irreversible and unavoidable impacts of climate change that is beyond the current means of adaptation. I guess that's my first question. I do have a second question, but I can mention it later.
Okay, so loss and damage. So we're happy for the Philippines to actually be hosting the board of the Loss and Damage Fund. And they had a recent meeting last early December. Loss and damage is quite a highly political issue. As you've said, it's been existing for quite a bit, because how do you measure the loss and damage that climate change has created in the past 2, 3, 4 decades already? So in our context, because we are an intergovernmental observer under the UNFCCC, or the Conference of Parties. So what we do is currently just observe, because there's no implementation guidelines that have been set up yet. But we are, of course, happy to support at the technical level if the board, or as well as the secretariat, requires any technical inputs. Our point would be is that there is a need to further accelerate adaptation investments, because if we don't adopt, loss and damage could only increase in the future. So our focus is really more on the mitigation and adaptation for now.
Thank you. And since we're also talking about sustainability reporting and practically investing in areas that are important to you, I'd also want to learn more about specific real-life scenarios where a sustainability report has been maybe a basis for investment banks like ADB when informing your decision making process for where you put your investments.
Okay, because I don't necessarily work. It's a different team within ADB who actually looks at who does the sustainability report, spearheaded by our environmental team, but all inputs come from all the departments and all teams within ADB, as well as our resident mission offices. Now, two things that I can give an example. One internally. So internally, ADB uses the sustainability report for our investors, actually. Green bond investors, which is mostly private companies in the European Union, have actually always looked at the sustainability report. So if the sustainability report is not doing well, then the investments in our green bonds is much, much less. So it gives us a benchmark on how to do better every year, including GHG emissions from our own operations, from our own building. And I think the development of rainwater harvesting, the solar panels that we have in the HQ, in the headquarters here, are actually results of the sustainability report through the years. Now we're also offsetting our annual meetings in terms of GHG emissions, which we actually also report on our sustainability report. So internally, in terms of operations, the results of that actually makes us do better in terms of our own operations. So that's one thing. And externally, in terms of our investors in our green bonds, because ADB has a green and blue bond framework, where actually it's a mix or blending finance with loan, equities, and bonds to actually accelerate some of the investments or the financing in some of the projects in the region. So that's another part of that.
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions online that are actually related. So I think the big elephant in the room is currently the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, as well as the commitments of President Trump's oil extraction priorities at the moment. So I'm just so I think the question online is asking, how do you see the actions of the US impacting climate resilient infrastructure transparency funding? This is a bit of a crystal ball gazing question, but I think related to that, there's also a related question. It says, what risks and opportunities does this emerging multipolar global order present to your work and your organizations? So I think it's still early days, but it really does not look too good, to be honest. But I think we do have to keep hopeful in light of the theme today. So it might be good to just hear your thoughts on this question. Okay, Ellie has bravely offered to go first.
I'll take a crack first because I don't like the pregnant silence. I'm just kidding. Yeah, well, the thing is, we already know what a Trump presidency looked like. He was president for 4 years, right, before he made his comeback. And of course, for the US part, there was a slowdown on ESG and climate change. And the thing with Trump, we know who he is, right? He has no pretensions, and I'm not saying it's a good thing, but there's more predictability on how to deal with him and how to deal with the situation. And if you recall, during his first presidency, organizations and companies in the U.S. who are already, who recognize climate change and are doing ESG initiatives, they still continue to do it. So, of course, in terms of just an example, you mentioned GCF. I know one big impact was when he became president, because the U.S. gives a lot of money to GCF. Oh my God, this is public. Anyway, a friend of mine told me that at the time the U.S. has like a monetary commitment, so half was already given, And when Trump became president, the other half was not given. So we will see, of course, more like that. Now, that's the risk, which we already know because when he know who he is. Now, the opportunity is it's an opportunity for the rest of the world to step up. Like here, as I said, the good thing about ASEAN is we don't politicize ESG. We will not depend on Trump policies, on how we how we deal with the impact of climate change, because we are already doing it. I mean, in terms of trade, probably there will be an impact. But again, the world is not just the US, right? So now it's an opportunity for other countries to step up. And in terms of philanthropic organizations, I think I'm not an expert on that, but there are a lot of philanthropic organizations based in the US. So now it's time to look at the East, right?
Okay, that's a hopeful note. Yes, we have to. All right, so but I'm just wondering from Esmyra and Evelyn, anything? Oh, okay, Esmyra, you want to go first?
Annie has actually beat me to it because for a multilateral institutions, it's not just about Trump, right? It's also an example of any government that has a different leader, that has a different priority. So it just happens to be Trump. This time, it could be someone else from another country, maybe, it could be anyone. But being a multilateral institution is that there are the other countries who are also our stakeholders. And so it's time for them to actually step up or be firm with the priorities that they want to put forth for the bank. So I think in that context, we will still forge on and have climate change as part of our priority, regardless of the changes in the government that some of our stakeholders may have and the changes in their priorities.
I think personally, this is not on behalf of my organization. I have to say that I totally agree with Ali and Esmyra.
We have to make our own disclaimer as well.
Yes, I think we have a challenge right now in front of us, but also an opportunity. So waiting for that. Yeah.
All right, okay, it's good that people in the room are choosing optimism because I think that is a choice at the end of the day. All right, so there is another question that came in online, and I think this is directed specifically to CoST. So, Evelyn, the question is, does CoST data disclosure comply with climate finance publication of data?
Yes, right now we have we validated this climate finance module with real data from South Africa. So we know that we can collect and analyze the data, indicators, and provide responses. Of course, the data was limited because it was just for validation purposes, but now we are implementing the module with real data and all data available in Malawi and in Nigeria. Kaduna is one of the champions in the OGP local program, so it's one of our champions too, and they are implementing this module. And we received just recently expressions of interest from Brazil, from Mexico, and Uganda. So basically, because we have partners there that are promoting this, and we will see the opportunity. So the idea is something that just started. I have to confess, we need to wait for the results, but I trust that we will have this year wonderful news about it.
Great. All right, so I'm just wondering whether there are further questions from the floor. Don't be shy, but I think in the meantime, while we wait, is that a hand? Oh, yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. My name Wulandari. I'm come from Indonesia, Bandung, Regency, West Java Province, and I'm active in Perkumpulan Initiative. I have conducted budget analysis of energy transition and climate change issue in Indonesia. One of the challenges is budget politics that has not sided with the energy transition issue. It's not priority in Indonesia because it's many other issue national strategies in the President Prabowo, and then climate change is not priority. The fiscal capacity is the law, and then the state budget and the regency budget level governance in district, it's not priority because its allocation of the budget is very low. And then I'm not optimist in Indonesia can be goals net zero emission or not, because Indonesia is have commitment in the forum for Paris Agreement, and I'm not optimistic because it's a very many performance in the state budget and local government budget is not improved to goals. And then because I don't know what the strategy for the have the budget politics is the strategy issue, and climate change is the priority with the in Indonesia is named RPJMN. It's the like planning in the president in with the have the 5 years what the priority, but it's not priority in my country. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a very interesting question in terms of budget prioritization, and also interesting in the Indonesian context, because Indonesia is a very decentralized country where provinces, regencies, cities, quota have their own independent processes as well. So I think it's so we've seen some really interesting examples from
Yes.
Indonesia where even though at the national level it may not be priority or not like the top
Yes.
priority, but at a local level they have actually opted to put it as a priority, and vice versa as well.
Yes, in Indonesia it's the national level, province, regency, and village levels. And then my attention is the awareness for the public. Okay, I'm encouraged is the School of Politic Budget for CSO, and it's the youth people in the campus is the university for the how the opportunity about the political will, okay, or to priority in the budget and the planning, because I don't know, because I'm not optimistic, but it's the but the School of Politic Budget is awareness of public. It's the allocation, okay, from the strategies issue. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. No, I think Indonesia really is a very interesting example in Asia and of course globally as well because of the decentralized system. So I'm wondering whether any of the speakers would like to speak specifically on budget prioritization, but maybe before we get to that, I could share very briefly on the work that CoST is doing in Indonesia. So I think, as you know, in CoST, unlike some of the other countries where we work with, where the membership is at a national level, for Indonesia specifically, our membership is at a local level. So we have the province of Nusa Tenggara Barat as well as a regency Lombok Barat that is implementing CoST. And it's interesting because I think at the local government, they've actually prioritized that, you know, we really want to improve transparency. And I think there is that political will, and that actually makes things possible. So I think you're right. You know, we can have very formal documentation of budget processes, etc. But if there is no political will to actually implement a particular policy initiative, it is very challenging, and we do recognize that. And I think that is why I think one of the reasons why we are organizing an event like this today is really to share some of the learnings that we have had across the regions and also across organizations to see how we can actually leverage on, I guess, what would be the policy levers for us to get policymakers and decision makers to act on it. And it's very interesting because I think the panelists all here actually have public policy management experience, right, in terms of both academia studies and as well as it through your practical work as well. So I think this is an opportunity for me to turn to our speakers to maybe you could share some of the experiences you have had in terms of working with governments as both the regulators as well as the policy implementers. So I think, that's the interesting thing about government, right? They both set policy as well as implement it. Yeah. Oh, all right. Okay. See, Esmyra with the mic. I don't know whether you want to take a stab at the first.
If I can go first.
Yes, of course.
No, because it's a response to our participant from Indonesia. I think I would encourage you to also be hopeful, because you were saying that you were not hopeful because of the government priorities. Because for one thing, I think when it comes to budgetary issues, there is a need to engage ministries of finance and ministries of budget, because one of the things about climate change is that we often look at the Ministry of Environment or a climate change commission, like in the Philippines. It's always that ministry that's actually involved. But in fact, if we're looking at budget, we're looking at fiscal space, it's the Ministry of Finance that we should be engaging. And we have a couple of our technical support to do that. And because you're from Indonesia, I would like to say that Indonesia, in a couple of weeks, is hosting the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action in Yogyakarta. The members of that CFCMA, or Coalition of Finance Ministers, will actually be convening in Yogyakarta to discuss climate change action following the 6 Helsinki Principles on climate change. So I think Indonesia hosting that speaks volumes of that. There are arms ministries that still has climate change as a priority. Again, it's just to highlight that the Ministry of Finance plays a critical role in terms of budget. Now, in terms of budget, for our client countries, we are also working with some of our client countries to actually establish a budget tagging system for climate change. So, in fact, I do have a technical assistance which will be doing a capacity building specifically to do budget tagging for climate change in all our developing member countries. So that's upcoming for later this year. It's also an acknowledgement that budget is quite critical. And so I'm hopeful for Indonesia, basically, because they are co-hosting the CFMCA, the Coalition of Finance Ministers. So there's the acknowledgement on that.
Okay, Ellie?
I'll add, in the spirit of optimism, let's continue that. I mean, I have worked for the Philippine government, and I think that's the challenge with any developing country. That's why, the status usually remains a developing, because there's still some, and the function of the status of developing countries is usually related also to governance, right? So that is a challenge of for a lot of developing countries. Continuity of policies and a lot of also politicking. Even if there's money, how can you be sure that money is being funneled to the right projects, or if it's clean from corruption? But I would say that, because if we look at, if you're looking at things, that things have to be done big and soon, then of course we will be depressed, right? Let's, as I said, then we just wait for the planet to explode and melt, right? But the thing is, we should look at pockets of successes. And I will just share you, because we have GRI, we have operations in Indonesia. So in terms, I'll just speak about, I'm not an expert on, Indonesian budget, also because I cannot read the budget in Bahasa. As I said, look at the pockets of successes. So we started working in Indonesia in 2018. The requirement for listed companies to issue sustainability report was issued, I think, around 2016. And I can say, and they implemented it in phases, like depending, listed companies first, financial issuers, blah, blah, blah. So over a period of 5 years. And I can say that, I think they already finished the phases. So I think I can say, in terms of listed companies, majority of listed companies and financial issuers are already doing sustainability report. Now, in terms of, because you talk about climate change, As you know, at the ASEAN level, there's already the sustainable finance taxonomy, and they've laid out there, the priority projects, and there's like a categorical statement there that, ASEAN is looking to phase out coal, right? Because any coal projects that would be implemented, I think 2020, starting 2023, 2024, will not get any financing. So when we were there, I think 2 years ago, we had a meeting with one of the coal-fired power plant, and we spoke to the CEO, and he said that we have no choice, we have to retire our power plant because the government says so. And he said, and besides, it's okay, there's financing available anyway. So that's why I said there's pockets of successes, because if we want change in a big and fast way, no, that will not happen, and that will just depress us. I mean, it's already depressing as it is. I was talking before the event, I was talking to Clara, I was like, if you look at the science, right, you look at all those numbers and science, we are already at the point of no return because we've already breached 1.5, right? Just last week, I was telling Clara, I was watching this documentary by the National Geographic, because all of the climate action that's being done by countries now, they're just calculating it based on the emissions that's in the atmosphere and calculating based on what will be, emitted. But it turns out that the permafrost, the carbon that's permanently frozen, which is no longer permanent because the planet is melting, was not calculated. And according to the scientists, what's trapped underneath is twice the emission that's in the atmosphere. So if you look at that, do you think we can catch up? I mean, watching that, documentary, I was like, oh my gosh, why am I working? What am I doing here? But the good thing is, there are now, innovations, right, in terms of technology. I think we're much smarter than 10, 50 years ago. So I think eventually, because human beings are pushed to action if it really affects them. So I think there's already a lot of technology and inventions that's being done. A case in point is, and I will ask you this also, if you can, because I can ask question, right? So. So like, for example, there's already for many years, there's a discussion about the carbon capture and storage. But the thing is, I think when I was reading about it, again, I'm not an expert. I'm just a humble social scientist. So when I read about it, the hindrance for countries taking it up, it's still the cost. But Esmyra, you were telling that there is actually money available. So, I'm not saying that the carbon capture storage is just the one solution available, but it's one solution that's available, right? So you have a basket of solutions. But I'm just wondering why it's not taking off. Because if you think about it, like, okay, then, it will help reduce the emission in the atmosphere. But how come countries are not jumping on it?
In terms of carbon capture storage, so we actually did have a fund on carbon capture storage focused on that in terms of technical assistance capacity, in terms of designing CCSU. I haven't been updated on what's happening in terms of that. I think partly it's priorities of governments. They don't see it as a priority in terms of investments. They don't want to take out loans for it because we are still a bank. Another part is that there hasn't been an actual successful pilot where they've actually captured and stored carbon in massive amounts. So I think that's another issue, that there is no good example yet, and that's why a lot of countries hasn't been picking it up.
I think this is really
There's
interesting.
also a fear, I think. This is from my personal point of view, the fear that once you capture it, how long will it stay down there? And then what happens after if there's a failure in the mechanism, like nuclear power plants, right? Do they get released? And how does that impact? So there's a lot of questions and apprehensions, I think. More people are conservative about it.
No, I think this is really relevant because another question came in online and it was specifically, I mean, not asking carbon capture, but I think a more general question in terms of the mismatch between climate finance available for mitigation, where the returns are clearer, but also in terms of climate finance for adaptation. And I think that's specifically where carbon capture and carbon sequestration technology falls under, where the potential for financial returns are still relatively limited, because I think it's still quite young, untested technology to be implemented at scale. I think there's obviously a lot of hopeful studies that demonstrated effectiveness at a small local level, but again, how does it translate to being put up at scale? So back to this online question, what is your view of this mismatch in terms of financing for adaptation and mitigation? Maybe from an ADB perspective, where do you see that coming to play in terms of prioritizing projects for financing?
I see both mitigation and adaptation equally important. So sometimes how to prioritize it depends on the country context. So, if you're looking at Bhutan, which is like net zero, it doesn't really emit, so you're looking at more on adaptation projects or countries in the Pacific. But if you're looking at bigger countries such as Indonesia or Bangladesh, then you look at it more on the mitigation. So from my side, it's equally important in looking at the mitigation and adaptation, but it depends on the country context in terms of prioritizing. Now, in terms of climate finance and how unequal it is, in fact, the Climate Policy Initiative, and I'm not sure if people are familiar with CPI, but they do produce a report every 2 years. They produce that skanky or spaghetti diagram where they actually show the flows of climate finance, where it's coming from, the use in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And yes, 80% of the climate finance flows in the last 2 years actually goes to mitigation. Which sectors? Obvious sectors such as energy and transport. Adaptation, which looks at around 20% of the mitigation flows mostly in agriculture, as well as urban and water sectors. Partly, the mitigation sector is, mitigation finance is quite high simply because they focus on a lot of infrastructure. When you're looking at renewable energy plants, when you're looking at transport system, a railway system actually costs a lot of money. So it's infrastructure driven, and the cost is obviously high. But when we're looking at adaptation, especially on water as well as in agriculture, we're looking at climate resilient agriculture, on crop rotation, on practices. So the finance that actually is needed, it's not really needed. That actual finance that actually flows it's quite smaller. So that's why it's an 80 or 20% decrease. But that doesn't mean that adaptation doesn't have a huge gap. It actually ranges from 350 to 700 billion a year that is actually needed for countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change. But the special feature about this CPI report is that we're talking about public finance, but only 51% of the climate finance actually came from public sources. 49% actually came from the private sector. So there is a lot of potential for private sector to come in, not just on mitigation, but more specifically on adaptation. Because I think private sector can play 3 critical roles. One is that they are adapters themselves. They have to adapt their own operations and their portfolio because they are experiencing climate change. They're actually enablers because they sometimes have the technology that can be used to conserve water, to use in irrigation for addressing drought in agriculture. So a lot of adaptation practices can actually be done. And of course, private sector is a financier, so that they actually shift some of the focus from the mitigation to the adaptation side. So there's actually great potential. Unfortunately, it's just a matter of, I think, mathematics currently in terms of the sheer cost of mitigation infrastructure in general. That's why it's happening. But I'm proud to say for ADB, it's a 60-40% split currently. So there's a lot of effort also on our adaptation finance.
Okay. Can I ask a question? I'm just kidding, because you've given us like a very you've given us a very clear picture of climate finance, but another terminology that's coming up because of all this sustainability and climate discussion is transition finance. That's financing to help high emitting sectors transition to a low carbon economy. So what about that?
So for ADB, we have a team which is called the Sustainability Finance Team. And under that team, they're looking at transition finance. Currently, ADB and the rest of the MDBs are looking at only reporting climate finance. Now, that definition of climate finance is based on that joint methodology. It currently does not include transition finance, where we're helping actually shift, like for shutting down coal, such as an energy transition mechanism, as part of that climate finance currently. But it's not, doesn't mean it's not important, it is. But we just don't count it yet as a climate finance.
Okay, I think I'll dial it back a bit. Going back to the question, I think specifically on budget. So I think Evelyn, and also this also came in just from the audience actually. Unfortunately, this participant had to leave early, but she left a question behind. So I think she wanted to know specifically in the context of developing nations with limited capacity for oversight, how can we ensure the transparency mechanism promoted by, I guess, what we call multi-stakeholder initiatives like CoST, accessible to public, but also effective in holding both governments and private sector accountable in the allocated use of climate finance. So I know there's a few parts to this question, but maybe it might also be interesting, Evelyn, that if you could also share some of the examples, how specifically as a multi-stakeholder initiative in different countries, how CoST has actually been working with governments to try to influence certain decisions and also the implementation. And so I think this would also address that earlier question on budget prioritization.
We work together with the three sectors, so we have a table in which they are seated together. They need to discuss and they need to address the issues that are affecting governance in the sector. But it's difficult, I have to say, I have to admit, because there's a conflict of interest in that table. Governments, private sector complaining because they don't receive payments on time. Then they stop the projects. Then the citizens complaining because the projects stopped, so they don't receive the benefits of that. The government saying, I don't pay because I don't have the resources, but I will pay. So it's a matter of starting the dialogue and trying to address the issues and trying to measure, let's say, the processes of payment. What is the problem? And going to the data, which is important to see where in that process is the problem, so we can solve it. So the idea of this multi-stakeholder group is to discuss these very specific details, but also trying to agree on a policy level how to improve, including how to prioritize the budget. Because we know in our country, I am coming from Honduras, it's a country in development, we know that the needs are education, health, roads, etc., etc. So it's difficult, and we need to compete for the resources. Internally, the Ministry of Education is going to the Congress to request to the congressman, please, for me, I need that budget. And the Ministry of Health is doing the same. So it's a matter of agreeing together the priorities and work together towards the common objective. And I think this table is really helpful to discuss this type of matters, because at the end, we all want the same. And when we find that understanding is, we have the same objective. We want this country to be developed. We don't want more people migrating. We want to keep our people in our country and provide the opportunities for a better future. So, yes, that is my input.
I think that's interesting because I think from our work we've also understand that organizations, governments are not monolithic. So I think obviously when we want to work with change makers, we also identify within these organizations, government entities, who would be the most willing parties to work with, to actually implement change. So I think there's a lot of in terms of strategy, in terms of engagement. So I'm also mindful of time. We just have 15 minutes to the end of the session. So I think this is last chance for one last round of questions from the audience as well as, in person as well as online. So I'm just wondering whether there's any further questions. Okay, then maybe if not, then I think this is my opportunity to ask questions. And of course, panelists, if you all would like to ask each other questions. But I think in terms of like a wrap up, I think, on this note of optimism, right? Because I think, again, I just love Ellie's expression, right? The word exploding and melting, burning and melting. I don't know in what order. But I think, a way for us to wrap up the session on a note of optimism and hope is what opportunities do you see where you are from exists for greater collaboration between these different sectors, businesses, governments, financial institutions, civil society, media, academia, to improve climate finance transparency. So, yeah, who would like to go first?
Can I?
Oh, sure.
I was just saying that I think we have the opportunity to work together, all of us. We share common goals and values, I think. We are here discussing the importance of transparency. So I think we have different resources, different tools, different ways of working at different levels, different scales. So I think just working together, we can make a difference. And this is not just for ourselves because we're living here, but for our children. And I think we have a better future if we work together. Yeah.
I guess three things, right? One, in terms of going back to the subject matter on climate finance and transparency, is that probably we can work together and enable technology solutions, creating platforms to share data, as well as two, doing global and regional knowledge sharing, as you said, that we can work together, which means we can also exchange knowledge, lessons learned, what has worked and has not worked. And I think this forum is one of those conduits to actually do that. And three, I think it's on a positive note, is that we always think about financing, money, and climate finance. But I think at the end of the day, climate finance will naturally flow if we think about the outcomes that we want to achieve. And that is not a melting planet, that we have a future for our children, our children's children, that we actually focus on the outcomes. So if we're looking at projects, we're looking at, even in capacity building, we want to look at the outcome of that project, which is a low carbon, climate resilient economy or development, or basically a hopeful future for everyone.
The good news is there's more awareness and action in terms of sustainability, ESG, and climate change. The bad news is we're not acting fast enough. So for us, for GRI, we're all about sustainability reporting, and I think sustainability reporting will not save the world, right? That's why I agree with what Evelyn said. It's a collaboration of different stakeholders. So climate finance is the input, right? Your output is your report, because that is the proof that you're using the financing in the right way, for the intended purpose, that you're using it prudently and judicially. And the outcome, of course, is a better planet. The problem is, because sustainability, as I said, the discussion on sustainability is fairly a young discussion. We have been destroying the planet longer than we're discussing sustainability. So the sustainability ecosystem is not really fully developed and interconnected and cohesive. And again, going back to the good news, because when we created the GRI in 1997, we're only few of those organizations talking about sustainable development and sustainability in general. In fact, the SDG came only in 2015, right? So it took a long time, but you see an explosion of organizations working on sustainability in the last 10, 15 decades. So I think the challenge now is everyone should be working together. But we all know that we all work in organizations. It's easier to work by yourself because you always agree with yourself, right? But working with other people, more so external organization, that is always the challenge. So I think again. In the spirit of being optimistic despite the sciences, I think the fact that we recognize that there is a problem, and when there's a recognition that there's a problem, then we will work towards solution. And the challenge now is how we can work together towards not just having a common goal towards a solution, but agreeing to work together, because we cannot really have we cannot expect everyone agreeing on a common goal, because again even different countries are at different stages of development. For example, in Europe, right, they're already talking about net zero. Here we're talking about adaptation, and that's the sentiment I get from companies when they have investors. Like, you're asking me to write a report on my net zero ambitions, when my concern is how do I make sure that the community where I'm operating will be resilient and adaptable to the impact of climate change. So yeah, I think I'll end there. Otherwise, I'll go on talking even when everyone has left. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right, so yeah, I think it's been a very enlightening discussion. But again, all talk, right? I think that's why it's really important for us, what next as well, right? I mean, I know we really do appreciate this opportunity to have to organize this event at the OGP regional meeting, because I think this really allows us to work with people across Asia and the Pacific region, globally, and across different organizations as well, to see what more can be done. I mean, to address these very pressing issues. Again, I really do hope that we'll all end this on an optimistic note, because if we don't take action, who will, right? So it has to start with us. But I think the fact that all of us are committed towards this, I think that's already a very hopeful first step. But I think there's still a lot more to do. We really do appreciate everyone's time and input, participating in person and online as well to these very important discussions. But again, this is just the beginning, not the end, and we do want to see. So of course, I think all of us, all the organizations on the panel today are working towards this issue of climate financing and transparency. And of course, feel free to contact us. We have a lot of resources online at all our respective websites. So I would really encourage participants to refer to our websites, look at the resources. And of course, we are all here as well. Feel free to approach us after the event. And also a little quick plug, OGP is organizing another specific session on interoperability on Friday afternoon. So if you want to discuss more on this topic, please attend that session as well. There'll be more opportunities for us to discuss what this translates to in practice. Okay, so on this note, I would like to express my biggest thanks to the panelists for agreeing to be to take time off this afternoon to be part of this session. So if I could also invite our audience to just give them a warm thanks, show of appreciation, and also to our online audience. Thank you very much.